Morning everyone, hopefully everyone can hear me okay. We still have a few people joining, but as the majority of people are on already, in the interest of time, we'll get started. Firstly, welcome and thank you for attending this webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars we're going to be running on test automation. We have 30 minutes this morning. This initial session is really an introduction and overview. From speaking to many different clients over the years, it's clear that different organizations see the value that automation can bring, but they're often confused around where to start. They're wary of starting off down a path that leads to a dead end, or starting something in a way that isn't efficient or optimized for their needs. So rather than adding value, if you're not careful, the whole thing can become like wading through mud, a maintenance nightmare where you spend more time updating and refreshing existing scripts than creating new ones. Today, we're going to be running through the basics end to end with a number of important take-home points, hints and tips, but the main objective of today is to bring everyone up to speed on the basics and how it all fits together and how you can provide and produce an end-to-end approach for how you will do automation within your organization. We can then look to build on this knowledge in other upcoming webinars, focusing on and deep diving into some of the detail. So a little about me. I'm Ash Gawthorpe, one of the co-founders of Ten10. My background's in hardware and software engineering, development, architecture, and with lots of experience in technical testing and designing testing solutions for clients. We'll be rattling through this at quite a pace today, but if you do miss something, this webinar will be available online, so you'll have the opportunity to stream it and review it again later. Finally, if you have a question, please enter it in the chat window on the right hand side and we'll try to answer as many as possible today. If we can't answer them on the call today, then we will respond back to you individually. Okay, so let's just start with some basics. Test automation is about executing a set of tests on a system under test automatically without human intervention. Initially, many people think of testing the front-end GUI, and this is often where the pain is felt most by manual test teams. Taking a set of manual tests and executing these in an automated fashion against a front end. But in practice, there are tests that can be automated at different levels, from exercising a public API down to directly accessing a DB layer or injecting messages into a middleware layer, or indeed directly executing parts of the application code itself. At this lower level, these tests against particular units of code are generally completed by the developers. For the purpose of this webinar, we're mainly going to be considering the top level, and as many of the tests executed by test teams are executed against the GUI, this is where the majority of focus and effort lies. On the plus side then, automation allows you to execute tests far faster, running them in parallel with the benefit of machine doing it in a repeatable and consistent fashion time and time again. In addition to these benefits, it should free up resources from the monotony of manually scripted tests to add value through different types of testing that people are far better at than machines. But I guess like everything in life, the benefit of automation doesn't come for free. It requires investment in tools. Now, whether the tools are licensed or not, it still requires that investment of time. It requires knowledge, experience, and careful consideration up front to ensure you're using the best fit tool for your needs. It requires your functional test scripts to be written in a way that makes it efficient to automate. And finally, and most importantly, it demands continuous and ongoing discipline to ensure that you're building on the strong foundation you've created up front with that initial set of tests that you create, and that as tests continue to be written and maintained, they're done so in the correct way in accordance with that best practice so it doesn't degrade over time. As a starting point then, surely automation is automation. Everybody has roughly the same requirements, focuses and challenges, you'd imagine. Unfortunately, in our experience, this doesn't really bear out. They don't, and the type of software an organization is testing has a significant bearing on how they approach automation. So as an example to illustrate this, let's just think about two different organizations. So company one in this example develops two key apps deployed to their 10,000 active users in more than 30 different countries. So both apps are developed using the same tools and technology stack, and they're deployed across multiple platforms. That's desktop, web, and across phones and tablets using native iOS and Android applications. So these applications are also developed by the internal development teams within Company One itself. Additionally, they also white label their application used by 10 different customers. So these are customers that take Company One's core app and they kind of reskin it and re-provision it for their own purpose, but essentially it's Company One's app. So the Company One apps rely on various third parties. So these are payment providers, postcode lookup services, credit rated agencies, all of which are cloud-based SaaS offerings that talk to Company One's app through REST-based APIs for interaction. Company One has never actually completed a full regression test across the different platforms and white label apps before a release because they simply don't have time. Estimates vary, but it's looking like it'd take anywhere between around 3 to 6 man-months to complete a full regression test, and they release fortnightly, so that simply isn't practical. Instead, they take a pragmatic approach and they focus testing on areas of change ahead of each release, and they do find issues when deploying the apps into production. The main point here for this illustration is that Company One is automating apps written in a single technology stack with a development team that they can interact and collaborate with in order to make the app more automatable. They're able to discuss tooling up front, they're able to discuss what they need around finding and discovering controls, so things like automation ID, setting policies, etc. And they're able to leverage any assets the dev team may have in place already. And this is very important because that dev team is there and is able to assist the test team in terms of making that automation process easier. So ultimately making it easier to develop new tests, but also minimizing the maintenance overhead to maintain current tests as well. And then finally, and very importantly, the dev teams are open to the idea of modifying the build process if it's required to build in libraries or device access lists or other prerequisites that an automation tool may need. Now, many automation discussions and examples that you find on the web, they focus on this type of requirement. A single app or maybe a couple of apps written on a common platform that are able to be automated and where you have access, full access to the build process and access to that development team. By way of a contrast, and at the other end of the spectrum, if we consider Company 2, now they don't develop their own software at all. Instead, what they do is they integrate 3 key enterprise applications and their internal users. Now there are 15,000 of them spread throughout 20 different countries in the world. In addition to these 3 core enterprise apps, they also use between them more than 100 different applications on their desktop. So new software is delivered regularly from the application vendors. Now this requires comprehensive integration testing to ensure connectivity isn't impacted, and additionally security and other patches are released by pretty much everybody with increasing frequency. So in order to perform a full regression test across Company 2's production estate, they reckon it's going to take around 6 man-months as well. The apps are all written in very different tools and technologies. So they consist of web applications. Now these vary from fairly new HTML5 apps down to some legacy Silverlight applications. And they have many different native applications running on the Windows desktop as well. In fact, they even have some old green screen apps that run a back office app running on an old IBM i-series. So if you just think about these 2 very different organizations, but they have essentially the same need for automation. They want to significantly reduce the time required to perform their testing manually. And in actual fact, they don't just want to reduce it, they actually just want to be able to run a test, because at the moment they can't. They simply isn't the time to be able to run that full regression test. So today we're looking to show you a common approach to automating the application landscape at either ends of this spectrum, as well as everything in between. Now looking at the invite list earlier, what I can see is that there are quite a number of people from different organizations that fall very much, I'd say, somewhere in between those two extremes on that spectrum. So hopefully what we're going to talk about here will be applicable to pretty much everybody. So let's start by looking at the variables to be considered in terms of working out the automation approach, as well as the different tool types and a way to estimate your ROI. If we think about the different variables that are at play here that can influence how you approach automation, there are many, and what I'm going to show you here isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but what's important is that you consider for your organization the relative risk or importance of each one. So if we start with applications first of all, so the first question is just how many apps are there in scope for automation? What type? What's the sort of the development and application and deployment stack that they run on? What's the relative business priority of each one of those applications? If you then think about the technology stack, whether you have access to the build process for that particular application, if you think about what else is coming down the line, and if you also give some thought to what issues do you see in production, what defects do you kind of find either in test or in prod for that matter, so where is the pain, and that's kind of tied in as well with how often is that application deployed. If we then move on to the next key point here, which is thinking about the people that we have to work with. So firstly, you want to think about the skill sets that exist within the test team. Ultimately, the people that are going to be running with this when it's kind of up and running, and when tests need to be maintained, and when new tests need to be created. Also, the development skills within the team. There are some apps or some automation apps that don't rely too much on development, but many do, and sooner or later you're going to need to start writing code in order to make this effective and scalable. You also want to think about, if you do have internal development teams, the languages and processes that are used by them. For example, there's no point in, if you're a Java shop, in choosing a tool that has its tests running in C#, for example, that integrates very well with Visual Studio. That's just not aligned to the core development skills within the business, and that's going to make it harder to integrate. And also, you're not going to be able to leverage that knowledge from the development team in the same way as well. You also need to think about just how long does it actually take to test those current applications at the moment. In the two examples I quoted there, neither organization was able to run a full regression test. But for this part, you need to be mindful of what organizations actually are testing at the moment ahead of each release, and then also what they would like to test if they had the time and the capability to be able to do it. And then finally, and this is sometimes a little bit harder to gauge, particularly if it's external vendors, but that level of collaboration between the development, test and operations team that's either in place or could be in place. As I mentioned before, different tools and different approaches to automation require a different level of interaction under the hood of that application. And if you are able to have conversations or to influence how that happens and how that works, then that can really make your life far, far easier when it comes to automating applications. And then finally, you need to consider the test processes that are in place at the moment. So first and foremost, is there a good manual test process in place? Are the test scripts that are available, are they detailed to the right level of detail? Are they consistent? Are they reviewed regularly? Is the coverage in place across the different applications? These things, you need to be aware of these, because essentially if the scripts aren't fit for purpose in terms of them being able to be automatable, then that can really cause you some problems further down the line, both in terms of estimating how long it's going to take, and also depending on who you have doing the automation, there might be a lot of assumed domain and application knowledge embedded within those scripts that if somebody is automating them isn't immediately obvious. The third point on here, good environments management and release management processes. This isn't directly related, but what we find is that we come across a lot of problems where test environments aren't managed or configured correctly, and so that can lead to a lot of issues around testing code and writing tests that turn out not to be fit for purpose or don't work in the way that you expect them to, not because the tests are incorrect or because the apps are incorrect, but as a result of environmental issues or issues with that release management process. And then finally, and one of the most important points, is understanding that level of change between each release. So how frequently they're released, but just as importantly, if not more importantly, the amount of change that goes on. And we'll look at this in a second, and what we'll realize is that this has a key part in determining the cost of automation in terms of understanding how much maintenance you'll need to do on existing scripts between each release. I just want to spend a minute looking at the different types of GUI automation tools. Fundamentally, there are two broad approaches to GUI automation. Both have their relative pros and cons, depending on the variables that we've just described. So let's have a look at these in a little bit more detail. Object-based tools work by controlling the application through an abstraction layer, an object hierarchy where every control that you can see, and some you can't, has a type and other associated attributes. So these allow you to identify it, hopefully, and once you've identified it, you're then able to interact with it at this level. So for example, you're able to enter text in text boxes, you're able to click on buttons, and you're also able to read back their state. So for example, is that tick box checked? What text is actually displayed in that text box? So tools such as Selenium, Appium, they all use this technique. We then have, on the other side of the fence, the image-based tools. Now, instead of identifying controls on a page through this abstraction layer, instead they find elements by visually matching the image of the control that the test script developer has captured when writing the script, and then comparing that and trying to find that image on the application on the screen. So if it's successfully found a match for that bitmap, for example, that might be the login button, the app will then move the mouse pointer over the image that matches the login button and click on the mouse button. So in effect, the effect is the same from a application point of view. Ultimately, it has found a control and it's interacted with it, it's clicked on it. If it then needs to read text from a text box, when you're writing the script, you indicate the region where the text should appear, and then the app uses OCR, so optical character recognition techniques, to read the text from the screen. So as I mentioned, both of these types of tools have their advantages and their shortcomings, some of which can be significant enough, in fact, to derail an automation project if the right type of tool for the right application isn't selected. Now, there's lots of debates around which one is best, and I'm going to leave that aside, but really there are several key points on each approach which I don't really think are open to question. So if we look at object-based, so initially what we're saying is that requires an in-depth knowledge of the application. In order to interact through that abstraction layer, you need to be able to interact with the app itself, and also it's the last point on the list, but that may require changes to the build process in order to build those libraries or whatever else is required in there for the app to be automatable. With the image-based approach, you don't need that. If you can throw the application up onto a monitor, then you are able to automate it. Now that works for tablets, that works for mobiles, that works for desktop apps, but it also works for set-top boxes, for smart TVs and various other sort of applications that you might need to automate as well. So it therefore requires, object-based, it requires setup for each application type. If you have 100 different applications, each one of these requires setup and requires you to have the in-depth knowledge of each application that you're testing. Whereas from the image-based one, that doesn't require any setup for each application. Object-based, when you're actually writing the scripts, progress can be very fast when you're actually automating the script, but then what you'll find is that often you'll come across some blocker, you'll come across some issue which can slow things down significantly. Whereas from an image-based point of view, progress tends to be a little slower, but it tends to be more consistent. So you then have, from an object-based point of view, in terms of its susceptibility to application changes, the app can be, or your test automation scripts can be susceptible to changes that are invisible to the user and indeed sometimes to the developer. If your app is relying on that abstraction layer, that object hierarchy, if that changes, then your automated scripts will fail. But the application may look absolutely identical, and it might be that the development team have done something under the bonnet which can severely impact your apps. From the image-based point of view, you don't have that susceptibility to internal changes, but they are very susceptible to visual changes. So if anything at all changes, perhaps around how buttons are rendered or color depth, that can have an impact on the image-based applications. So for object-based, there's a wide variety of tools and frameworks for each application stack. By far, the majority of tools out there in the market work using this approach. For image-based, there are far fewer tools, and many of them, if not all of them, tend to be commercial tools that require licensing. From the object-based point of view, then, test execution is generally pretty quick, or at least in our experience, significantly faster than image-based, which tends to be slower and also tends to be far more compute intensive because it's having to do an awful lot of work in order to look at a screen and work out and match whereabouts that image is that you've found. And then ditto for reading text back, OCR techniques, they require a lot of processing power to be able to do that. And in fact, they can be a little bit susceptible as well to change and not always give you 100% accurate results. But one big thing that the image-based tools do have going for them is that they do not require any changes to the build process in order to build in libraries or anything else. So I think in terms of which one will work best for you, it's really all about context. Each type has its place, and for some use cases, an object-based approach is head and shoulders above image-based, and in other use cases, an object-based approach will be disastrous, and sometimes vice versa. And in fact, some tools can sit across both camps, where you can end up with the best of both worlds. So for example, Ranorex is one tool, a commercial tool, which does support both that object-based and image-based approach. If we go back then to the company 1 and company 2 and the examples that we discussed before, with that in mind and me describing the different types of GUI automation tools, it should be pretty clear which one sort of aligns best to company 1 or company 2. At a high level, given that company 1 has a very small number of applications, they're all developed using the same application stack, they have the ability to modify that build process, they have access to the development teams, that very clearly points towards an object-based tool. On the other hand, company 2, the fact that they have hundreds of different applications that are in scope, apps that are written across many different, using many different tools and across many different technology stacks, and also the fact that they don't have access to any of those development teams, or very unlikely they'll be able to modify any of those build processes, that leans itself far more towards an image-based approach. In your applications, you may find that it's more nuanced than that, and chances are it won't be quite so clear-cut. So that really makes us now sort of move on to the next step, which is working out just how we truly work out what's going to be the best tool, which is going to, or even a number of tools that are going to work best with your approach and with your organization. So in order to do that, I mean, we find that the best way to do that, and there is no substitute for actually running a proof of concept project using a variety of tools against your actual applications. Before we can run our POC, we just need to take a step back and make sure that we've done sort of everything that we need in order to be able to run a successful proof of concept that's going to give us the insights and the answers that we're really looking for. So first of all, do we have our in-scope application or applications agreed? Do we know the target platforms for our app or applications that will be deployed on and that's in scope for the proof of concept. If we decided on a short list of tools and how those map to our skill sets or potential capability for the test teams or whichever teams will actually be running with the automation. And finally, do we have our tests defined that are in scope for our POC? And also an understanding of the size and scale of the overall test scripts that we need to create, but crucially, do we have our POC scoped out to say these are the individual tests that are in scope for this POC that we're going to run? So assuming we have all that, we're now in a position where we can actually run our proof of concept on those applications using these tools. Now, my advice here is don't go easy at this stage. And in fact, there's a number of pitfalls here which I'm just going to run through with you. So the first thing is to ensure that the scope covers the nastiest parts of your nastiest, gnarliest applications. If you have anything that's a little bit unusual, if you have anything that you think is going to be troublesome, make sure that goes in the melting pot. You're not interested in the happy path here. You don't want to find yourself in a situation a few months down the line after you've made a tool choice where you find that there's some part of the application that there's a massive showstopper and the tool you've chosen will not allow you to automate it. This is your chance to put everything that is going to be nasty that could potentially be a showstopper in that proof of concept. Secondly, pitfall 2 around scripts not being in a state to be automatable. I mentioned before that you need scripts which can be identified easily, that can be picked up by different members of the team without necessarily needing a lot of application or domain knowledge, because you may at some point find yourselves bringing in individuals, perhaps from development teams, perhaps from other parts of the business, perhaps from an external business, who have an understanding of those tools and are able to automate those for you. But that will only work if those scripts are able to be picked up and able to be run with by somebody else. Pitfall number 3, most, if not nearly all, tools come with some form of record and playback GUI. My advice is that they are useful to be able to identify controls. They're a good starting point to be able to feel your way around a tool and have it generate code for you that you can then read and understand kind of how it's working. But you do not want to be in a position where you are using those scripts in production. There's a very common anti-pattern where it's very quick to record a set of scripts and then play those back. It gives you an initial sort of set of results, but those scripts are incredibly brittle, and also there's no reuse between them as well. If you try and continue with that, you will very quickly find yourself coming to a grinding halt. In summary, just don't do it. Pitfall number 4 is around consistency. You may write a script as part of your proof of concept. You then play it back and it works perfectly fine 9 times out of 10. At that point, don't just sweep that under the carpet and think, oh well, that's nothing really to worry about. Those problems will manifest themselves more and more as time goes by. There's probably a reason for that inconsistency. Perhaps it's the case that you're clicking on a button and it doesn't always click on it. Perhaps it can't always find a control. Sometimes those issues are down to synchronization. Sometimes it can be something a whole lot nastier that's lurking beyond the surface. As soon as you find something like that as part of the POC, you want to jump all over it and get a very, very good answer and a good understanding of what's causing it. Pitfall 5. Now this is a big one, and what I'd advise you to do here as part of that POC is to not just run with one version of the application, but if you can have a previous version of the application and a current version of the application. Write the script against the previous version and then run it against the current version, just to help you understand the level of change that may have gone on within that application. If you're using an object-based tool, then the app may look the same, but the development team, as part of that deployment and release process and build process, it could be that they have changed things in that object model behind the scenes that will break your scripts. That kind of thing is exactly what you need to be aware of, because that will allow you to build into your forecasting how much sort of maintenance you feel that you may need in there, and also that will allow you to pull that together for the return on investment metrics. And crucially, if you are seeing those kind of changes without a good reason for them, that's the time to raise it with the development teams if you can, and ask them why are they doing that, and to try and have them stop doing that in the future unless they have a very good reason to. Pitfall number 6, rushing into the tool too early. This work around this POC to evaluate the best tool or best tools, any time that you spend here is really time well spent. What you don't want to do is just jump straight into the tech and just start selecting a tool and then just start wiring your way through the regression pack with it. If you're not doing that with your eyes open and you're just down and blinkered in amongst the muck and the bullets, if you're not careful, you can come unstuck really, really quickly. Finally, there's one opportunity here as well. As you're creating these automated test scripts, just be aware and mindful of the test data that's required in order to run those tests. One value add that automation can bring, in addition to actually executing tests, is that you can automate to be able to automatically set up test data, which your tests may well modify or destroy. And you can also use test automation to check the validity of test data before you start. That will allow you to very quickly ascertain whether you're in a good place and whether the tests that you then run, whether they're manual or automated, whether they're going to be successful or whether you're going to have some problems halfway through as a result of test data not being set up correctly. Okay, so we're now at a point where we've run our proof of concept. We've evaluated the results from the tools that we pulled together as part of that scope, and we've kind of decided on a particular tool that we feel would provide us with the best option. So what do we do now in terms of the next steps? What do we do now in terms of taking it from that proof of concept to something which is much larger, where we can start to sort of put the meat on the bones and really turn this into a larger scale automation project? I think one of the key things to this has been able to calculate that ROI. So far at this stage, the project's been pretty small, it's been pretty limited. At this point now, we're now sort of saying we have a way forward, and sooner or later we need to start pulling an idea together for how much it's going to cost, what the sort of budget would need to be in order to be able to automate the regression pack, whether that's in its entirety or whether that's a number of phased pilot projects and then a larger project. But in order to be able to do that, you need to understand where the ROI case is. What's that return on investment that you're going to get through automating those apps above and beyond just running manual tests on them? So in order to do this, now this can be a bit of an art rather than a science, really, because there's a lot of variables at play. But some of the key ones is that you need to understand from the test scripts that you've produced, or the manual test scripts that exist currently, what the kind of number of steps are in each one of those scripts. So that's a step can be any sort of interaction with the app. So it can be clicking on a button, clicking on a entering text in a text field, but it can also be an assertion as well. So it can be checking that something exists on a page or doesn't exist. It can be reading text from a text box back, or reading from a list, or seeing how many entries there are in that list. Each one of those is a step. And when you understand the number of steps that you have in a script, and then you understand how many scripts that you have, when you couple that with the results of your POC around how long it took for you to perform each one of those steps, then you can start to build a picture of how long it's going to take. Also from that POC, hopefully if you manage to do it across a number of different versions of the applications, you'll have a view of just how much rework was required from the script that was created with a previous version to a script that's created with a current version. Armed with this, you can then apply a sort of percentage overhead on top of the work that needs to go on, just to account for the amount of maintenance required in order to maintain the current scripts as opposed to creating new ones. And in terms of that step time, one key understanding here is the variability of the step time. I think I mentioned before on one of the previous slides when we were talking about the object-based approach, the fact that you can be wiring your way through it, and it can all be going very well, and you can be very efficient in terms of how many steps you're getting through and how many you're creating, and then you hit some blocker, you'll hit something out of the blue, which will just really have you scratching your head for a good while in terms of understanding how you can fix that problem and how you can get over it. It's that variability that will really sort of mess up your estimates and mess up those ROI calculations if you're not careful. So it's very, very important to have a handle on that. And then once you understand that, then you understand essentially how long it's going to take. You can apply a cost to that and understand how much it's going to cost. And then the ROI comes from working out how many times essentially you need to run those tests manually before you actually get a return on that investment. Now that's assuming, of course, that you can run all those tests at the moment. In the two examples I gave you before of company 1 and company 2, that simply wasn't the case. They just didn't have time to be able to do that. So there's maybe a cost saving, but there's maybe also a difference in terms of just how much testing that you can do here and how you can reduce that risk. So in terms of once you've sort of calculated the ROI and you understand that and you've come up with a good business case for it and you've kind of got the green light to go ahead, just in terms of a few tips to sort of get you started and to hopefully try and keep you on the sort of straight and narrow, really. So our advice is firstly to go for wide coverage across the applications. So start off, and depending on how your teams are structured and depending on how many people you have to do this might be easier and how many apps you have to automate. But essentially you want to, rather than just going narrow and deep straight away, our advice is to go wide and start covering a wide number of areas across those apps. So there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, that will give you good visibility of any problems that may be lurking further down the line, which if you encounter those in a particular functional area of an app, for example, that will then allow you to go back to your ROI and sort of and revisit those estimates. And secondly, once you have those scripts in place, you're then able to use those scripts for, as I mentioned before, perhaps data creation, but also around environment pipe cleaning and also around health checking of those applications, particularly if your environments management and sort of release management processes aren't perhaps as robust as they could be, and you do have problems, then if you have a small number of scripts which provide wide functional coverage, then you're able to run those very quickly, very early on, as soon as an app's deployed, to be able to determine whether the app has been deployed properly or whether there are issues with it. Third point on there, now this is more of a tip to avoid, really. If you're not careful, it's very easy to get dragged down into thinking, if I create lots of tests, then that must be a good thing. So you maybe create one automated test, and then you think, well, I can create a whole load off the back of this very easily. There's an issue with that, in that you need to think as you're doing it that every time that you're writing and creating a test, you're actually creating overhead in terms of maintenance that's required there. So in terms of the number of tests, very much less is more, really. So you don't really want to use that number of tests as a KPI to indicate that things are going really well. If you created 100 tests, those tests might not be especially valuable. It could be that 10 tests is actually far more useful than the 100, and particularly from the point of view of you then have potentially far less maintenance on those tests that you've created. Make sure that you've considered test execution infrastructure. If you're using a commercial tool and you need a number of agents to be deployed that are executing those tests, that costs. If you're not able to use, or if your apps are deployed on-prem, then you need to consider infrastructure hardware to run those tests from as well. There could be quite a long lead time on that. That could be tricky to procure. These kind of things you want to consider as early as possible and not have that as a blocker as you're going along. So ensure time is set aside to maintain scripts. I can't stress this enough, really. And expectations need to be set with stakeholders, that it's not just going to be constantly about writing new tests, and that, for example, if an app is deployed or a new version of the app is deployed, and there isn't necessarily any new functionality in it, that doesn't mean to say that you're going to be able to run the full regression test just for free. There may be changes that are required to those scripts in order to make them work. And finally, just the last point on here, this is probably a webinar in its own right, really, but what we've focused on here is GUI level test automation, really because from a lot of customers that we've spoken to, particularly those that have large manual regression packs, that resonates quite strongly with them. But in actual fact, if you can automate those scripts at a lower level, if, for example, you have an application that is speaking to a common API, then it might be that depth testing of all the different scenarios can actually be run through that API with the GUI automation provided across all the different platforms at a slightly higher level perhaps. The further you go down that stack, the quicker the tests run as a rule, but also they require less maintenance and become less brittle. So that's a very, very important point to consider as well. Okay, well that's pretty much everything I wanted to run through today. Apologies, I have slightly overrun here. I can see that we do have a couple of questions that have come in, but I'm afraid what we'll need to do, we will respond to the individuals that have asked those just via email or via some other channel. And I think it just remains for me to say thank you very much for listening today. I hope that's been helpful to you and has maybe given you some pointers and approach that you could possibly look at using yourself. In terms of where we're going to go next with this, I think next is probably going to be a case of diving into some of the different tools and kind of showing you how they work on kind of a bit more of a practical level, and maybe kind of we can show you an example of where a practical example of how some of those tools work better in some app types than in others. But anyway, that's for another day. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for attending, and I hope you have a good day. Lovely, thanks.